My first began back in 1981, and I recently got married, and I wrote my first published novel, which was a very bad spy thriller called Dead Letter Drop. And we got burgled, and a young detective came to the house, and he saw my book, and he said, "Oh, you're a writer." He said, "If you ever want research help with the police, give me a call." And a guy called Mike Harris, and he was married to a detective. And my then wife, who was a lawyer, and I became friends with them, and they invited us to a barbecue at their house that summer. And there were 12 of their friends there, all in the police. There was a homicide detective, response, traffic cop, there was a police diver. And just talking to these people, I thought, wow, nobody sees more of human life in a 30-year career than a police officer. And, and they realized I was genuinely interested, not just out to get a story I could sell to the local paper. They started to trust me. And over the next decade, they started to say, well, they'd phone me up. So we're doing a raid tomorrow. You want to come with us? And take me on ride-alongs. And I was writing initially supernatural, then psychological thrillers. And I started putting police characters into the books. And they liked the way I portrayed them. And they kind of started getting even more enthusiastic. And they'd smuggle me into crime scenes. And in 1997, I was introduced to this young homicide detective called David Gayler. And I always remember going to his office, and I've never seen an office such a mess. Every inch of the floor was covered in blue and green crates, bulging with manila folders. And I could just see this balding head at the back. And I said, "Are you moving office?" He said, "No." He said, "I'm a homicide detective. I've also been tasked with reopening all the unsolved murders in the county of Sussex. Each one of these crates contains the principal case file. I am the last chance each victim has for justice and their family has for closure." And I loved that human image about him. And he said, and he said, "What are you writing at the moment?" I said, "I'm writing a psychological thriller called Denial." He said, I've been halfway through it. He said, "Tell me about it." So I started telling him. I said, "Hang on. Why is your detective not doing this? And why hasn't he got an outside inquiry team looking into this? And that lady, I don't think she'd have done this. I think she'd have done that." I thought, wow, this guy's got a really creative streak in him. And we really hit it off. He helped me a lot on that book and on the next book. And in 2002, I always remember this. I was standing outside the Vatican in St. Mark's Square, and I got a phone call from my agent saying, Pan Macmillan have just lost their number one crime writer, Peter Robinson. He's moved to another publishing house. Had you ever thought of creating a detective as a fictional character? So I phoned Dave Gayler, and he'd just been promoted to Detective Chief Superintendent, head of major crime for the county of Sussex. Sussex is, for those who don't know, it's on the south coast of England. Its kind of best known town is Brighton and Hove, big seaside city. Anyway, I rang him and I said, "How would you like to be a fictional cop?" And he loved it. And he became my real life Roy Grace. We worked together closely on every single book. He doesn't look like Roy Grace, but everything else in terms of career, what he does, and he became my real character. The hardest thing is to create characters that come off the page. And when you've got characters that are actually on screen and you meet them and get to know them, like I got to know John Sim, um, I know when I sit down to start writing the next book, I know how he laughs, how he talks, how he moves his hands, and it helps bring the characters so much more alive too. If I'd had to do a police e-fit back in 2002 when I was creating Roy Grace, it would have come up with John Sim. So when ITV were presenting cast choices to me and I saw his name on the list, I thought, oh yes. And then Glenn Branson, his kind of sidekick, he I actually went out with this black cop in about 1997 on patrol in Brighton. Big tall guy with a shaven head, and he's like 32 years old. And I said to him, are you, how long, how old are you? And he said, "I'm 32." I said, "Are you going to go for promotion anytime? You're still just a, police constable." He said, "Oh, actually, I only been in the police force it's my first week out of probation." He said, I was a nightclub bouncer and my kid was born. And I looked down and I thought, one day you're going to go to school. Someone's going to ask what your dad does for a living. And I want you to be able to say something you're proud of. And I joined the police. He was called Glenn Douglas and I made him Glenn Branson. And I worked with a real life detective who's become, for the last 25 years, and he helps me on my research. And he said, when Grace is filmed, the guy who has to play Glenn Branson is Richie Campbell. So I already had the two characters kind of in my head. And I find it really helpful. My kind of favorite character in the books, outside of Roy Grace and Glenn, is Norman Potting. And I didn't have him in the first book in Dead Simple, but then I was doing some research and I was up in those days, Brighton Police Station had a bar and cops used to sort of gather there at the sort of late afternoon and drink. And I got cornered by this guy. He was what they call in England an old sweat. A kind of guy, yeah, cop in his kind of 50s, kind of close to retirement, and he had a bad comb over, and he told, he basically, he was completely politically incorrect. He was using every kind of forbidden language, even back then. And he had basically single-handedly solved pretty much every major crime in Sussex by himself. And I thought, you have to be a character. So I introduced Norman Potting into Looking Good Dead. And what's been so wonderful about him is that not a week goes by when I don't get an email from a cop somewhere in the world saying, we have Norman Potting in our office. Basically, 10 years ago, a friend of mine emailed me and said, whatever you're doing, stop doing it. Go out and buy a copy of the Daily Mail. That's like the biggest newspaper in England. So I went out and there was a photograph of Camilla, then Duchess of Cornwall, sitting in her office with two Roy Grace novels right behind her head. And she said I was one of her two favorite authors. The other was Jane Austen. So I wrote her a letter and said, thank you. That was really kind of you. And she wrote back a handwritten, chatty letter saying, yeah, Roy Grace really is my favorite detective. I've read every single book he's in. Um, don't stop. And she then, we had this correspondence and went on, and she started a book club, which is on Instagram. It's now called the Queen's Reading Room. It's huge. She started during lockdown to try to encourage people to read. And she wrote to me and she said, when are you going to set Roy Grace novel in London? And things have not ended well for people who disobey Queens of England in the past. You know, lose their head or get burnt on the stake. So I thought, okay, if I'm going to set Roy Grace in London, we're better than Buckingham Palace. So I came up with an idea for The Hawk is Dead, about a thriller set in Buckingham Palace and how Roy Grace could be brought in because he works in Sussex. And I sent it to her, and she loved it, and it was signed off by Buckingham Palace Comms. And the story begins with the Queen and her entourage, with Queen Camilla and her entourage on the royal train, and they're coming down to Sussex in the south of England to start a 2-day tour of hospices, and they use the royal train as a kind of palace on wheels. So it saves them having to go back to London. They literally do their events for the day and then they park it in a siding and it's heavily guarded. And then it's got bedrooms in it. It's got a bath. It's an avocado colored bath suite, kitchens. So it is like literally a hotel mini palace on wheels. And so I've got her coming down to Brighton and Roy Grace and his team have been warned that there's a Not My King protest going on in Brighton, so the police are on high alert. And then as the train comes into a tunnel about 5 miles north of Brighton, it is derailed, and the Queen, you know, flashes on its side. The Queen dusts herself down and she helps get people off the train and out of the tunnel. And as they emerge out of the tunnel, a senior member of the royal household who's standing next to her is shot dead by a sniper. And everyone thinks that this is an assassination attempt on the Queen that's failed. except for Roy Grace. He says, this guy was standing 4 feet from her. A sniper might miss by 4 inches. He's not going to miss by 4 feet. And the story goes on from there. The king then summons him and says, "What's all this nonsense? You don't think my wife is a target?" And I had huge behind the scenes help on the book. I think it helped the fact that she was so enthusiastic about the book. I had like 3.5 hour tour behind the scenes of Buckingham Palace, up on the roof, down in the basement. And I got lots of little detail. I got one scene when King Charles summons His Grace into his office, and the king stands up and puts both hands in his pockets. And one of the household staff who read I got different people to read different scenes. He said, no, the king wouldn't put both hands in his pocket ever. He put one. So I got all little sort of details like that. And I saw the Queen last July, and she said to me, "How's the book coming along?" I said, "Well, I've got you being quite heroic, Your Majesty, helping people off the crashed train." She said, "I don't know if I would be that heroic." And then I got the August Dead is coming out in October 21st, but I got quite nervous when I'd finished it because I've got quite a lot of chapters with her speaking and with the King Charles actually speaking. I put words in their mouth. I've got a scene when she's having breakfast with the king and she feeds a bit of toast under the table to her two dogs. So I thought, before we go any further, I better get a copy of this book to her if she wants any changes. So in March, my publishers printed a special early proof, and they put 001 on the front. And I had it hand delivered to the Queen, to Queen Camilla, and I said, "Your Majesty, this is the first copy in existence of The Hawk is Dead. Please have a look at it. If there's anything you want changed or you're not happy about, let me know." And I met her a week later at Clarence House, and she came striding over with a big smile. She said, "I absolutely loved it. Don't change a word." So I could not have been more happy about that.